Ni No Kuni 2 Revenant Kingdom, the Princes edition on Nintendo Switch. Now predominantly I want to know about performance, having played through this one over on PlayStation. With that in mind then, we'll concentrate first on the visuals and performance because that may be the area you're most worried about, and we'll have story, gameplay and controls at the end of the video. A thanks to Bandai Namco UK for the review copy, but has this turned out to be Ni No Kuni? Crash of the Switch. Ouch. Let's find out. Looking at the visuals and performance then, let's start out with the resolution. Ni No Kuni 2 on Switch runs at a very decent resolution. It looks to be native or near native, and as we've seen with a few games, the first opening hour or so run very well indeed, but this isn't always the case. Just like the first game, they've carried that Ghibli style, and from an animation and visual quality standpoint, it looks delightful. The protagonists' garments blow in the wind as they run around, and the environments themselves are quite strong. Where the Switch version struggles with clarity though, is when you move to the larger areas, the open map sections, which see your characters change to a smaller cartoonish version of themselves, have much higher draw distances, and as such the frame rate comes tumbling down. In the game's defense, these areas don't require a great amount of reaction time, but the same also applies to some of the larger areas you'll visit later in the experience. Shadow resolution has held up nicely. Every character and item casts a shadow. However, the level of detailed draw distance on the dynamic shadows cast in the world is quite close to the player, and you will be able to see this moving backwards and forwards as it disappears and reappears into the world. The most comparable game we've got on Switch is probably Dragon Quest XI in terms of the overall visual quality. However, I do think that ran much better. I would have really hoped to have seen some form of text size toggle on the Switch version, but that's not the case, and it is just a tiny bit too small. It's okay in handheld, as you can obviously move it closer to your face, and it's just passable in docked, but it's a shame not to see that. As far as frame rate then, well, we've got a bit of variance here. I was delighted to see that it was hitting 60 FPS in the earlier stages, and my hopes were certainly raised, and I wouldn't say they were dashed when it went down to 20 in the open world map, because you don't need good reactions for that area, but personally I think having it locked out at 30 and trying to really target that may have been a slightly better option. Now when you enter combat instances, because it's a smaller scale area, I wouldn't say the frame rate here is a real issue. What I haven't been able to test, because it's a bit further in, is how the kingdom building mechanics will carry across. There's a chance that that may lag the game down a touch, but I'll be sure to include that when we do our patched up videos. Where Ni No Kuni 2 excels though, and always has done, is with its excellent audio score. This includes performances by the Tokyo Philharmonic Orchestra, which comes on the soundtrack, and this Princes edition is really one to own physically because you get so much extra like that. Once again, to make a direct comparison to Dragon Quest XI in terms of audio, I feel like Ni No Kuni 2 has a more successful score in terms of how it synergizes with the on-screen action, although it doesn't always escape that feeling of mismatch between what you're hearing and what you're seeing. A prime example of this is in the earlier pirate area, where you'll be wandering around having a few battles, but generally things are pretty chill, and in the background this is playing. For the most part, I found the sound effects to be good. In combat, the hacking and slashing all sounds appropriate, but unlike some other games, it isn't voice acted in every scene. And it's quite jarring how you can be reading text and suddenly they start speaking, and then they stop, and then they start. It's obviously a massive undertaking to voice every piece of dialogue like they did in Dragon Quest, but it's impactful, and if you're able to do it with a high budget, certainly Bandai Namco and Level 5 fall into that category, then it makes a world of difference. An example of this where it affected gameplay were when two characters were chatting on screen while you were running around the world, and the text was so quick there was no way, unless you were Superman, you were ever going to be able to read it. An issue totally negated with spoken dialogue. Visuals and performance on the Switch version score 14 out of 20. They are passable and image quality is very good, but go in knowing that in those larger areas you will experience some quite significant slowdown. I haven't had any crashes, and it seems like a few of the earlier bugs released in the original game have been removed. The soundtrack's very good, nothing less of which would be expected from the legendary Joe Hisaishi. And the voice acting of the main characters is solid enough, particularly in comparison to some of the JRPGs we've reviewed.
I'll hold him off for as long as I can.
And do expect a certain amount of cheese when it comes to the writing.
I'm going to build a kingdom where everyone can live happily ever after.
Audio scores 18 out of 20. The story this time is set several hundred years after the events of the first game, and as such you'll be playing as an entire new cast, one of them being an actual president, Roland, and the other Evan, king of Ding Dong Dell. Oh yes, they really called it that. But the two of these main characters are actually from different worlds. Unfortunately for Roland, his morning cappuccino is spoiled after a nuclear missile is seen exploding in the distance, forcing him into another dimension. When he lands on Evan's lap, almost literally, there's a coup attempt taking place, which sees Evan fleeing for his life. The main crux of Ni No Kuni 2 then sees the two of them band together, followed by many other companions, as they try and rebuild Evan's kingdom. Unlike my recently reviewed Eastward, it doesn't avoid the tropes of JRPGs, instead embracing them. I found it initially a little bit difficult to relate to some of the characters, and while they're not the deepest, I did engage in the end, and it told a tale that all ages could enjoy. This is much more of an action RPG, or a JRPG with action combat, you decide. When enemies are seen in the overworld map, you'll be able to engage with them at your leisure or try and run away. This then starts a combat instance. The original release of Ni No Kuni 2 was heavily criticized because it was so easy, and if you're playing on the normal mode, don't expect any real challenge when it comes to the combat. Now that doesn't mean it's bad. As someone without a great deal of time, I really appreciated being able to blast through some of those lesser enemies, but when it comes to boss fights, you do expect to have to try a little harder. That's not really the case here. You can switch between your different weapons with the intent of choosing the one with the highest percentage, because that is useful for performing some of your special abilities, but really you don't need to, because you just end up spamming them to death. You can use the right trigger and then a combination of the A, B, X and Y to perform any magic abilities that weapon has, and you can dodge, roll and lock on. The unique twist here are the Higgledies, and if you're in the UK and you've ever watched the Teletubbies, that's essentially, yeah, it's those but shrank down. They have almost the same voice. These little creatures will aid you in battle, and you'll unlock new ones which have different elemental effects. As you're going about your fight, they may create an area which you can go into, press A, and they'll start firing off cannon shots. Or if you leave them, they'll passively heal you, plus they look pretty awesome. I don't think I've seen a more Japanese thing than a Higgledy, and quite frankly, I quite love them. It's nice how you find new ones throughout the world, and this is optional. And then there is a synergy system, whereby pairing up the right ones will increase their potency. There can't really be an argument that combat's too easy, because just simply choosing those two harder modes makes the game significantly more difficult, plus you can switch that on the fly in the menu at any point. I didn't do that because I just wanted to enjoy myself, but you can. As you progress, you'll find lots of different side quests, and the main quest line easy enough to follow. The mapping system's decent, and they also include fast travel very early on. There's a manual saving system, but you'll also be able to save from the menu in any overworld area. You'll find a number of different control options, such as the sensitivities, the XY axis, just not some of the more obvious ones like that text size. Forgive this brief piece of PlayStation footage, but I wanted to show you the kingdom building. This essentially turns the game into an old school strategy builder. You can choose different buildings, which in your town you'll then be able to purchase items from, and it was a really great touch. Initially, this is quite optional. However, they do unfortunately use it as a checkpoint system for progress, forcing the player to have to go and grind for certain items to improve and build up your town. There's a good chance you may never notice that because you were building up your town and taking your time anyway, but I'm also acutely aware that for some players it's going to be very frustrating hitting that kind of wall. Finally then, there are the skirmishes. They're clearly there to represent the fact that you're growing this kingdom and have a large army, but if you remember the old game cannon fodder, it's essentially that with a large group. Simply move them towards the enemy and they'll do the rest. In fact, thinking about it, cannon fodder was probably a little more complex. For me, this aspect of the game wasn't quite there. Despite the flaws, I had a very good time with Ni No Kuni 2. If you've only played the first, then some of these changes might not sit well with you. Combat feels oversimplified in comparison, or much less cumbersome and streamlined, depending on your perspective and the amount of time you've got. The controls are okay, and some of the movement animations are a little bit clunky, such as jumping and some of the creeping animations. For my personal preference, I give gameplay 16 out of 20, and the controls also score 16 out of 20. In terms of the package you're getting, this is definitely the premium and best version of Ni No Kuni 2. It's the Prince's Edition, which included all of the DLCs that had been released. It also included the Prince's Equipment Pack, which took me a little by surprise when I went to the first shop in the game and found all this amazing gear for 1 piece of gold each. If you're going for the physical version, here in the UK you can already get 12% off at shop2.net, and I'm sure in America there are a number of places you can do the same. Unlike many JRPGs, this one isn't overly huge. You're looking at around about 30 to 40 hours, depending on how much you want to do. And the game carries a 10.6 gigabyte download. I enjoyed the game a lot, albeit not quite as much as the first release, but certainly it has high production values and a lot of streamlined systems. The real crux will be whether or not you connect with Evan and the other main characters. Value scores 16 out of 20. So there we have it for Ni No Kuni 2 on Switch. Performance takes a few hits from time to time, but still it's a lovely experience and it's a really nice one to play in handheld. Its scores are very respectable, 80%. Thanks again to Bandai Namco for the review copy, and to all of you who enjoy the channel, hope you've enjoyed this one and you've got the information you need. And as always, for all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!